So now we're going to move on to how does body size affect animal physiology? So we're going to look at how the laws of physics can affect the anatomy and physiology of animals. For example, like the force of gravity limits how large an animal can be and still move efficiently. So if you think about something large like an elephant, you don't really see elephants run, right? They just, when they want to move quickly, they kind of just walk faster, but they can't really gallop. That's because they're limited. They're limited by their anatomy because they weigh a lot, so they're not able to put that much um, like pressure on their limbs. And so body size also has effects on how animals function. So large animals need more food than smaller animals do, obviously, right? Um, and that means that they produce more waste. They can also take longer to mature. So again, comparing something like an elephant or even a human to compare to like a mouse or a rabbit, those those smaller animals uh, reproduce a lot quicker, a lot more rapidly. But they also tend to live shorter lifespans. And animals that take longer to mature, they live longer lifespans. And then you can also see that smaller animals lose heat and water more rapidly. So they're more susceptible to things like dehydration um, or freezing. Right? So even animals of the same species can have these problems when you compare an adult to an infant, right? So for humans, a baby is more uh, susceptible to losing heat than an adult, right? And that all has to do with surface area to volume ratio. Okay, so animals span an incredible range of body masses. So you can go from like a shrew size animal, which is pretty much like the size of your headphones, or an elephant, or even like or a blue whale, something huge like that. But the fundamental relationships between surface area and volume pose challenges. Okay? And surface area is important in animals because oxygen and nutrients have to diffuse into cells, and also waste products have to diffuse out of those cells. So the larger the surface area an animal has compared to its volume, the more efficient it would be for those nutrients to move in and also for the waste products to move out. Okay, so the surface area and that's because the surface area determines the rate at which those nutrients diffuse across a membrane into the cell, and also the rate at which the products diffuse out. And this is important because as a cell gets larger, the volume increases at a faster rate than the surface area. And you can see on this diagram how the surface area here is shown as a linear function or as a function of the linear uh, dimension squared, whereas the volume is shown as a function of the linear dimension cubed. Okay? And so as the organism gets bigger, that surface area to volume ratio will get smaller. So when you compare like this first cube, the little one, the ratio here is 6 to 1 because the way you get the ratio is just dividing the surface area by the volume. So here it's 6 to 1, okay, because you're dividing 6 by 1. For this one, it's 3 to 1 because 24 divided by 8 is 3. 54 divided by 27, that's 2. Okay, and then 96 divided by 64, that's 1.5. So as the organism gets bigger, that surface area to volume ratio will get smaller. Okay. Here you can show Here you can see that the surface area and volume of a cube versus the length of a side. So the volume increases at a faster rate than the surface area. So the cell volume determines the rate at which the nutrients are used and the heat and waste products are produced. So as the cell gets larger, the volume increases much faster than its surface area does. And the ratio of the surface area to volume affects the animal's overall physiology because, because larger cells have a lower surface area to volume ratios than smaller cells. And this also ties into things like metabolism. So the metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in an animal or an organism in general. Okay? And the metabolic rate is the overall rate of energy consumption, which is measured by the rate of oxygen consumption. And the basal metabolic rate is just the rate at which an animal consumes oxygen while at rest on an empty stomach. Okay? That's just the way that that's measured. Okay? Because if it's, yeah, it's just the way that they measure it because depending on the level of activity an animal has, it would have a different metabolic rate. So they measure it at rest on an empty stomach. Then we have mass specific basal metabolic rate, which is just a function of body mass. Okay. So here we can see how small animals have a higher relative metabolic rates than larger animals do. So the elephant here, you can see it's on the has a lower mass specific metabolic rate than something like a bat or a house mouse. Okay. And at the very top here, that would be a shrew. Okay, these are tiny animals that kind of look like mice, but they they're not mice. They're actually they're mammals, but they're more closely related to things like hedgehogs than they are to mice. Okay. And then there's some adaptations that increase the surface area. So these are ways for structures to have a high surface area to volume ratio. And you can see them in different places. So in fish, you can see flattening of the gills. So this is the gill lamellae. Okay. This increases the surface area to volume ratio for fish. So this allows for, the absorption of oxygen. There's folding that you can see in intestines, like the small intestine. Okay. And here there's two types of folding actually. There's the folding of the actual intestine, and then there's also smaller foldings that are called villi. And all of this improves or increases the surface area to volume ratio, which allows for uh, absorption of nutrients. And then you can also see it in uh, branching in things like capillaries, which are just smaller blood vessels. So here, having a higher surface area to volume ratio increases how oxygen is delivered to tissues. All right, next we're going to move on to homeostasis. So homeostasis is um, the stability in chemical and physical conditions within an organism's cells, tissues, and organs. And these are internal conditions that remain stable even though the organism's environment changes. There are two different approaches to maintaining homeostasis. There's regulate or conform. So most animals will fall somewhere in between these two. So When organisms regulate, they are actively maintaining a constant internal condition, even though the environment is fluctuating. So, for example, a dog can maintain uh, a constant body temperature of about 38 degrees Celsius, whether it's cold or hot. So, if it's too cold, it would shiver. If it's too hot, it would just pant. Right? But those are ways that it regulates its body temperature. And then there's other organisms that conform to their external environment. So, for example, the body temperature of an Antarctic fish called the rock cod. Though the fish are able to closely match, um, or the body temperature of the fish closely matches that of the surrounding seawater. And this is just an adaptation because if it did try to keep a constant body temperature that was higher than the seawater, it would just it would require too much energy, right? Because the water, the heat always moves from on a sort of downhill. It goes from high to low, so it would just lose a lot of heat to the surrounding water. So, and that requires energy. Just keeping that engine going requires a lot of energy. So the adaptation here is just to conform and keep the body temperature the same as the environment. All right. And then you can also see the role of epithelia and how that plays in achieving homeostasis. So epithelia acts as an interface between the internal and external environments, and it's responsible for forming an internal environment that is different than the external environment. So this allows for the internal environment to be maintained at a constant level or at constant levels. So homeostasis is also dependent on enzyme function. Okay? And enzymes are proteins that catalyze chemical reactions within cells. So things like temperature, pH, and other physical or chemical conditions can affect the the function of enzymes. So for example, temperature, when you increase the temperature, that usually increases the rate at which those enzymes function, okay, to a certain degree. If you go beyond uh, boiling temperature, it'll denature the enzyme and then it won't function as well. Okay. And you can also see that molecules, cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems function at an optimal level when homeostasis occurs. All right, so now we're going to look at the role of regulation and feedback. So most animals have regulatory systems that constantly monitor internal conditions like temperature, blood pressure, blood glucose levels, and each variable has a set point. So this is a target value for the variable. And then a homeostatic system is based on three general components. There's the sensor, right? The integrator and the effector. The sensor is the structure that senses some aspect of the external or internal environment, like for example, the temperature receptors on the skin. The integrator is the one that evaluates that incoming sensory information by comparing it to the set point and then determining whether that a response is necessary. So for example, the hypothalamus compares the set point to the current body temperature. So here you can see these negative feedback loops. So here we have a homeostasis, which is for body temperature. If there's too much heat, there's going to be sensors, right, on the skin. Then it'll lead into the integrator in the brain, like the hypothalamus, and that'll tell the body what to do. So if it's too warm, it's going to tell the body to, or the dog in this case, to pant. And then that'll cool off the animal. That'll cool off the animal. Same for the opposite condition. So if it's too cold, those sensory receptors on the skin will pick that up. It'll tell the brain, or it'll send that information to the brain. The brain will compare that to the set value, and then the integrator will tell the dog to shiver, and that increases the body temperature. Okay, the effector is any structure that helps restore the internal condition being monitored. So, for example, shivering generates warmth, or when birds, fluff their feathers to insulate and retain heat. And so homeostatic systems are based on negative feedback loops. The effectors return internal conditions to set point values. For example, cooling, heating, or behavioral and physiological responses to body temperature. And these feedback systems usually work in antagonistic pairs. And this just means that when one is activated, the other one will be impaired or inhibited. So, for example, in that dog feedback loop, if the dog is too cold, it'll shiver, right? So the shivering, uh, the antagonistic pair for the shivering would be panting. So when one is activated, so for example, if the dog is shivering, then the panting will be inhibited. They won't act, simultaneously. Okay, so you can see that input from sensors and integrators happen continuously because the body's constantly trying to maintain homeostasis. All right, so to wrap this up, you can go ahead and watch this video that's on the PowerPoint slide, which pretty much summarizes homeostasis. All right, so we'll pause here.